Today in the garden I'm doing some soil improvement in a couple of areas, one of which is my lawn, and I'm going to be using this hollow tine aerator, which I didn't have any luck with this time last year, but I've got some ideas on how to make it work. But this is your last chance. I've got two soil improvement jobs to do today in the garden. The first one is around these laurels that I planted a year ago in this grass area, and they're really not thriving. I think because the grass and weeds around them are taking any water and nutrients in the soil away from them. So I'm going to remove the grass and replace it with compost. So I set up a string line at an offset from the fence at each end to cut a nice straight border edge. So my pins are set out, I've got my string line. All I have to do now is pull it tight and tie it off. And I've got a nice little tip actually for tying off string lines that I learnt on site a long time ago. So come and have a look at this. So one of the challenges with tying off string lines is if you actually use knots, they can be a real pain to get off, and you end up with knots in the string and it just delays you as well. So this is a little tip that I learnt on site. So just once round, and that means that as I pull here I can make this string line really tight. So this is now tight like a guitar string. If I then just do a few turns around the pin, once I'm in that position, I get the original string and then bring it back and bring it over the turns that I've just made. That means that when I release this, the string line is still dead tight and I've not had to use any knots. And when you come to release it, all you need to do is take the tension off, push it down to the bottom, take all this off, and it's now released. I make sure the line isn't snagged anywhere before I start cutting. I use a straight board just to help run the edger along, and I'm aiming at staying 10mm away from the string line. If you try to run exactly along the string line, you'll end up moving it and continuously having to put it back in place. So if you aim for a small offset that you can easily judge, it makes life a lot easier. The first pass, I just mark the surface. Then with the board out the way, I can come back and cut to full depth. Hiring a mechanical turf cutter, which I'll be doing in a few weeks' time for an area on the other side of the garden, obviously makes this job a lot easier. But in this location, working around the laurels and the fence, I wouldn't be able to use it even if I had one available. So that's not taken much more than 10 or 15 minutes, but it isn't the easiest of work, but probably easier than what's coming next. And halfway through, my super duper Samsung watch told me it detected a workout. Cheeky. Sod removal is one of the most difficult items I find in the garden. It's a lot easier if you've got a really flat spade, which I haven't. Mine's curved a little bit. It'd be nice to have a flat spade to be able to get underneath and cut a flat line. So that makes things a little bit more challenging for me. Actually, when it comes to cutting the edge, that's quite satisfying. It doesn't take too long. Now taking up a couple of inches of turf, that's the difficult bit. Once I've got an edge started, I can make some progress, albeit on my hands and knees, to get the spade in at a shallow angle. When you take on a job like this, you have to make sure that you've got an area big enough to dump the turf, because it does add up quite quickly and you always end up with more than you think you're going to get. I replace it with compost on the surface, which will give nutrition to the laurels once the earthworms get to work, without me having to dig it in. Well, that's what Charles Dowding tells me, so I'm not going to argue. So I've got an area of lawn here that's about a square metre, and it's a bit of a high spot, and I think because of that it doesn't get the water that the sort of valleys get, and it's all sort of dried out and it's a different colour to the rest of the lawn. And I've had these sort of areas on nearly every lawn I've ever had, and because they go dry, rather than sort of fertile soil, you end up with this sort of dry rubbish that the grass can't grow, and then it's like a vicious cycle. Now, when I'm going to be overseeding this lawn and using some soil and sand mix just to fill in and start levelling it, this isn't really going to get much, because once again it's a high spot, so the valleys are going to get a lot. This is just going to get a very sort of light brushing over, so that's not really going to help. So I've got a little trick that I've used a couple of times on this lawn that I can show you using a hollow core aerator, the sort of thing that you buy in the DIY shop, to improve an area like this without taking it all out and relaying it. So let me go and get that tool and I'll show you what I mean. This is a hollow core or hollow tine aerator. It's essentially 5 tubes that cut into the lawn under your own weight and take out a core or plug of turf, leaving a hole. To improve a small area like this, if I make lots of holes and then fill them with new fertile soil and then seed, within weeks not only are the replaced plugs nice and green, but it also helps the adjacent grass and generally improves the whole area without having to remove a patch. All of this relies though on firstly taking out lots of plugs of turf. So this is where we hit our first problem. The problem mainly being that these cheap aerators just don't really work very well. If you can see here, although it looks like I've done 4 rows of 5 cores, this row here, nothing has come out of this core yet, so it's not producing cores. All it's producing is a hole in the ground, a bit like driving a stake into the ground, which is not what I want, because that's actually compacting the ground around it. If anything, I want to loosen it up, not compact it more. So that's the problem with these cheap handheld aerators, is they all get bunged up, and before you know it, it's almost impossible to get it in the ground, and it definitely doesn't work as you think it's going to. So before we try any further, let's take this into a workshop and see if we can improve it. So when I bought this a year ago, I had visions of getting back from the shop and merrily coring thousands of holes in my lawn in an hour or so. And it was only after the second time I put it into the ground I realised that there was a fundamental problem, that these things get completely bunged up, and even with my whole weight bouncing up and down trying to push it into the ground, nothing was going anywhere. And if I've got that problem, then I'm sure many other people have as well. So these are one of these tools that you buy, they're fairly cheap, you use once and they never come out of the garage again. So let me just explain to you what I think is going on. So the way they've designed this is that they've made the hole that you initially cut smaller than the rest of the core, with the idea that as the core travels upwards through this tube, it doesn't suffer from too much friction, because you've actually cored a small core and it's moving into a big hole. In practice, that doesn't seem to make much difference, to be honest with you. And if I just run my metal bar down on the inside there, maybe the internal diameter of this is maybe 1 millimeter bigger than this, but there's such a long tube here, and this is sort of like 6 inches of tube, that the core soon opens up, and the friction along here just means that it gets stuck as well. The second thing that's going on is that this front face isn't really sharpened in any way. Although it's cut at a sort of, I don't know, 60-degree angle, it's not sharp. So I'm going to do two things. The first thing is I'm going to sharpen this up with a Dremel type tool to see if that makes a difference. And I also want to lubricate on the insides of these. Now, lubricating with like oil or grease on the inside, you don't really want to do if you're going to be reusing those cores or they're going to be going back into the garden. But I'm not going to be doing that. All the cores that I take out are going to be thrown away and disposed of and good material put in. So I haven't got really too much worry about getting a little bit of grease on the topsoil. I use a steel grinding wheel on my fake Dremel to sharpen the edges of each tine. So many garden tools like edgers and shears are sold with blunt blades from new, and this is a job I've carried out on many of them over the years. Oh. So that was like 10 minutes of grinding, and looking at that, I think that's a lot sharper than it was, and hopefully that helps cut into the turf. Now all we have to do now is give it a bit of lubrication on the inside. So that's everything greased up, which should help a little bit. And everything sharpened up as well. If I just take a bit of this grease off, I don't want it really going all over the grass. So let's get back out there and see if this makes any difference. On the first couple of rows, the aerator seemed to cut better and did eject the plugs. However, it wasn't long before I got into trouble. God damn. So I think sharpening the ends has helped, but what I found is any lubrication with the grease just gets pushed out with the first couple of bits of soil, and it's still sticking, especially on this side. But don't worry, I have a plan B, and it's not going to take 2 minutes to make either. So back to the workshop, let's see if we can sort this one out. My plan here is to knock up an unblocker that I can use to help eject the plugs from the cylinders after each cut, using my own weight without having to stop and turn it over to clear them. So I'm mounting 5 M8 bolts on a decking board at the same centres as the cutters that I can then push the aerator onto and eject the plugs. So that's a double nut on the end of each one locked in, and it's all lining up, although that double nut is only just a little bit smaller than the internal diameter of these, so I think I might be being a bit optimistic. If that doesn't work, I'll just take the nuts off and just use the thread, but let's be optimistic, shall we? My optimism didn't last long. Even with my whole weight on the tool, the plugs are so well stuck into the cylinders that trying to push out 5 in one go is just too much. So I reduce my expectations and go for 1 instead, which proves to be just manageable, but not perfect, because these are the longest bolts I have and aren't really long enough to fully eject the core. And for one of them, even my whole weight doesn't move the plug inside. Get out. Get out. cannot believe this is so hard. And I wouldn't mind if the soil was dry, but it's like middle of April, it's still fairly wet. Maybe that's the problem. Such a stupid machine. Come out, come out. So I concluded with myself that my improvements didn't work to any noticeable extent, and I just struggled on to complete this small area the best I could. Finally, with all the holes cored, I use a good topsoil and force it into each hole that I've made. This isn't the sort of thing you could practically do on a really large area, but up to a square metre it's completely possible. I leave each hole a little low from the surface and then just spread out the excess soil. I water, which highlights the cores, and then drop a few grass seeds into each plug. Brushing the surface lightly seals the plugs with the excess topsoil and covers and protects the seeds, which will start germinating in a week or so if the temperature of the soil stays above 10 degrees C. So there you go, that's that square metre improved, and that will do quite well and start growing over the next couple of the weeks. The sun's out, it's a little bit warmer. With that improved soil, that seed will germinate quite nicely and also improve the grass around it as well. As for this tool, it is a right piece of rubbish and I'm never ever going to be using it again. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please check out the other ones on the channel. Please check out our Patreon page, and maybe next time I'll be using a tool that actually works.